go through it, and we're going to kind of check out the psalm. We're going to start in verse 1. Our quote comes from about verse 7 or so about halfway through the psalm. They didn't have a problem with starting halfway through a psalm and reciting it. They didn't have a problem starting at the beginning if they were referencing the whole psalm, like Jesus on the cross when he says, my, why have you forsaken me? It's the first line of Psalm 22. Very likely, Jesus was referencing, pointing, bringing to mind in those words not only his experience, but the entirety of that psalm. And so when we get here, our duty, our job, is to go back and think, what is this about? So in Psalm 95, let's look at the first 5 verses. Right, oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving, and let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God, a king above all gods. And in his hand are the depths of the earth, and the heights of the mountain are also his. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. So what's going on in those first 5 verses there? Yeah. A call to worship? To listen? Praise? How is that praise made? Yeah, there's a joyfulness, a thanksgiving, an adulation. You can use all sorts of words. There are apparently songs that are sung, prayers that are made, maybe even the idea of let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. That can certainly be sung. You can sing thanksgiving to the Lord. You can just speak thanksgiving to the Lord. You can pray. You can pray in thanks to the Lord. So there's all these different ways that these people might have done this. But the idea is that when you stop and think about God, there should be a kind of response. And this response is one that's full of joy, thanksgiving, and why, ultimately, is there joy and thanksgiving? As you're thinking about that, notice that he says, let us come before the Lord in a grouchy, cynical way. It's just not there. Right? And so this sort of speaks to the attitude of God's people. Right? So there's sort of like a cultural stigma that has attached itself to Christianity. And one of those things is that I've heard people joke all the time that if it's fun, it must be a sin. Right? That's not at all the God of the Bible. That's not the way that God is. Now, there are things that our society or culture might call fun that could be sinful, but God here, this is joy, right? This is a moment of adulation. And so God made us to be joyful people. Now, it doesn't always mean that things are going well, but it means that in spite of how things are going, there should be this joy that exists, a peace that exists. And why can that joy and peace exist? Yeah, he's the great God. Look at what it says. He is a great king above all gods. We typically don't think about that too much anymore because our culture has kind of dismissed polytheism. You don't have tribal gods. There's not a god of Tennessee, and that is at war constantly with the god of Kentucky, probably because Kentucky knows they would lose, right? And so there's not this constant conflict of deities. But here there was. I was joking, Mr. Pickard. We all know Kentucky would win. There's this constant conflict of deities in the Old Testament worlds, where when 2 tribes went to war, it wasn't just the people fighting, it was the gods fighting, so to speak. Right, you can maybe recall some stories in the Old Testament where people would say things like, well, we were fighting in the hills and their god was a god of the hills, so let's go fight in the plains and then we will win. And that was kind of the way that people thought about things. And so this idea that your God is the great God, the king of all the gods, would give you comfort. In fact, you as a Jew would know that the other gods, they're not even real gods, right? They're just dreams of people. They have made them up. Or they're demons. posing as divinity. And so there's this sense in which you know that your God is the only real God. And if there is kind of this conflict of deities, yours is going to win. Right? So you don't have to worry about things. And not only that, but he has chosen you. He has delivered you. He is your Savior, your Redeemer, your Father, your mother is one of the pictures that is used, a nursing mother, right? All of these beautiful images of intimacy between you and this King of all kings. And not only is he sovereign, he is also good. That's the thing about having somebody who is ultimately in control, a sovereign. Right? The Greeks recognized, like Plato in his Republic, he kind of recognized that it would be best if you just cut out the populace. Right? You don't need people voting. You don't need people getting together in committee. You just need one person leading and deciding for the people. What's the problem with that? It depends on that person, right? And so, I mean, it sounds really good in theory. If we could just get one really intelligent, really strong, really compassionate, really kind, just incredible person to lead us, then we wouldn't need all this other stuff and everything would be great. The problem is, I don't know that that person has ever existed, except for God. Right? And then when Christ comes, you see that embodied in the flesh for the first time. And so here, this is kind of the idea. That idea that perfect leader is who your king is. And so you have great reason to rejoice, great reason to offer praise and thanksgiving. Now the problem in this relationship, we've just said all these great things about God. So if there are problems in this relationship, whose problems are they? Ours. Yeah, that's the second half of the psalm. Okay, so come, verse 6. Let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. He is our God. We are the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hand. And that's a beautiful image. He is the shepherd. He leads us. All we have to do is follow the shepherd. Right? He's going to bring us to the still waters. He's going to bring us to the green pasture. If there is danger, he will lead us through the valley of the shadow of death. In fact, even more than that, he will prepare a table for you in the presence of your enemies. You have nothing to fear. You just have to trust and follow the shepherd. But today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test, and they put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. So this is Exodus 17. Turn over there real quick. So now you have two fingers in your Bible, Psalm 95 and Hebrews 3. So this is Exodus 17. And this is kind of how often things happen when somebody is using the Old Testament text in the New Testament. They expected you to know some things. And so you'll get a passing reference, and they may not even tell you where the passage is. They're just going to reference something, and they expect you to know. And so here, he doesn't tell you where this is happening. He just references it at Massah and Meribah. Well, that's at Exodus chapter 17. So the congregation of Israel is moving into the wilderness by stages according to the commandment of God. And the people are going to argue with Moses because there is no water. And they come to him and they say, give us some water to drink. And you can tell from Moses' response, why are you quarreling with me? Why are you testing the Lord? That this wasn't a polite request. Right? They're not saying, hey, Moses, we're really thirsty. We could use some water. That's not how this interaction is taking place. The people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So where do the people want to go? Back to Egypt. You remember those cucumbers we used to have in Egypt? Man, wasn't it great? Yeah, I mean, you were slaves, and Pharaoh threw all your children in the river, but there were cucumbers. Wow. Right? And so the people want to go back to Egypt. There's this constant draw. And throughout the text of Scripture, you're going to see, right, through the Old Testament history, you're going to see Israel constantly wanting to go back to Egypt. God will constantly be saying, don't go to Pharaoh for help. Don't run away to Egypt. Just don't. Not a good idea. And always they want to go back. So Egypt kind of becomes a trope or an image or picture. And it's bad. It's bondage. It's slavery. It's the dominion of sin. It is the fear of death. And this idea of the people wanting to go back to Egypt is really a rejection of God. Right? So that's what we're going to see here. So they cry out, we want to go back. Behold, I will stand before you. So the Lord speaks to Moses, I'm going to stand before you. I'm going to bring water out of the rock, and the people will all drink of it. And so Moses did in the sight of the elders, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord not among us? So you have Massah and Meribah, which means testing and quarreling. So they put God to the test. Is God able to save us? We don't think he is. Prove that he can save us. Sort of like Satan tempts Jesus. Toss yourself off and the Lord will save you. And then the quarreling, this idea of fighting and strife. Saul, why do you kick against the goads, sort of thing. And when you go back to the psalm, and he conjures up this image of fighting with the Lord, of quarreling with the Lord, of not trusting the Lord, he calls it having a hard heart. And these people, what has just happened in Exodus 17? That ought to remind them that God can do anything. They've got food coming out of the sky. The Red Sea. Yes, he saved them. Powerful, with an uplifted arm. There's those 10 plagues that come upon the Egyptians, and God delivers them from Egypt. They spoil the Egyptians want them gone so bad, they're like throwing money at them. Please, just leave, take all of our stuff, just go away. We don't want you to have any reason to stay here. So God has done all of these things, and he calls them out into the wilderness. You have the whole incident with the Red Sea, where they're caught between Pharaoh's army and the sea, and it's a bad tactical position. So God sends down a wall of fire around them and protects them. Then he splits the sea in half. He walks them across the sea. He washes away Pharaoh's army. He starts feeding them out of the sky, and they're going to complain now. And so you've got these people whom Paul would say were baptized into Moses. That's his language over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Are these people the redeemed people of God or not? Yes. He has redeemed them out of Egypt with a mighty hand. He's baptized them through the water into Moses. He's bringing them into the wilderness. He's feeding them from the sky. Right? I mean, they're his people. Do they turn their back on him? Very quickly. Surprisingly fast. And that's sort of what this psalm conjures up. If you hear his voice, and you do, because day to day pours forth knowledge, night to night speaks, right? Psalm 19. Everywhere about you is the Lord's voice. You have scripture if you're Jewish or if you're Hebrew. You have all of these things. God is with you. You have the prophets. God is with you. You can hear him speaking. Do not harden your hearts. For 40 years I loathed that generation, and I said, they are a people who go astray in their heart. They haven't known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they will not enter my rest. So you have this picture of God's people who were delivered and who very quickly want to go back to bondage, to the point where God says, fine, you don't get to enter my rest. And that whole generation who saw all the signs, people 20 and older, are going to die in the wilderness, even though they were redeemed. God brought them out, he saved them with an uplifted arm, and yet they die in the wilderness. Why? They rejected God. They were faithless. It wasn't God's problem. It was their problem. And so now, if you go back to Hebrews chapter 3, and you have the writer pulling up this, right? This is something that you would have had read at attending synagogue probably every time. If not every time, very nearly every time. And he quotes this section from Psalm 95, and then he says, take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil and unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. Now in that story, that history that we just referenced from the people of Israel, was that theory or was that reality? Did they really fall away from God, or were they never really God's people to start with? Yeah, they really were his people. He really sent the 10 signs, the wonders amongst the Egyptians. He really brought them through the Red Sea. He was really feeding them. They were his people. That was his promise. I will be your God, you will be my people. But they rejected God, and they fell away because they had an evil, unbelieving heart. And if you want to think of evil, it doesn't necessarily mean like pirate, right? It can mean morally corrupt. It can also just mean bad, like a bad heart, a heart that isn't working the way that it ought to. And so sometimes in the text, in the New Testament text, you'll see that word evil, and we think like morally wicked or morally corrupt. It doesn't always mean that. Here you kind of get like a blending of the two. Their heart isn't soft. Their heart isn't opened to the Lord. They've cut him off, so to speak. They're not willing to allow God to soften their hearts, to lead them, to put, to write on their hearts, so to speak, to use some of the New Testament language. But they have this evil, unbelieving heart that leads them to fall away from God. So is this just like a warning, like a scary story that Christians tell one another to kind of like scare them into obedience, the bogeyman hiding in your closet if you don't clean your room? Or is this a reality? Can this happen? I see people nodding. Yeah, if this can't happen, then I don't understand what happened with Exodus. I mean, I can't make sense of what happened there if the Lord's people didn't fall away. Yes, the story gets told over and over. Every time the people fall away, God comes back to this event. I saved you out of Egypt. That's what the Passover is supposed to do every year. You're supposed to recite in your family, the Lord delivered me from Egypt. That's who you are if you are an Israelite. And we, as the Lord's people today, we have been delivered out of bondage. We've been delivered out of Egypt. We have been baptized into a relationship with the Lord, just like they were. And just like they could choose to fall away, right, they could choose to reject God. They put him to the test. They quarreled with him at Massah and Meribah. We too can quarrel with him. And so the power of this element here, this reciting this psalm, is that it brings up the entirety of that psalm. This is who you ought to be. People who are joyful, people who are praising, who are thanksgiving towards the Lord. So be careful that you don't become something else. Be careful that you don't forget, that you don't focus on something that is temporary. And let this temporary trouble, this apparent lack of water, which God is feeding you out of the sky, he can give you water too. Don't let this temporary trouble make you forget that you are serving and following an eternal God who has the world in his hand. The sea and the dry land are his. The depths and the heights are his. God has it under control. And even if it seems from your perspective like things maybe are not the way they ought to be, God is in control. Watch your heart. Be careful. Because if you become like those people at Massah and Meribah, and you have that evil, unbelieving heart, it can lead you to fall away. And that's the warning. Yes, I think that's exactly right. So the question was, is this not couched in terms of Jesus and their relationship to Christ? That's where we're headed next. Yes. Yeah. And the interesting thing about this is the new Egypt, which you'll see over in the book of Revelation, which is kind of interesting. The new Egypt is Israel. All through the Old Testament, the people of God have been becoming the nations of the world. That's a really sad story. God pulls them out of Egypt. He brings them into the wilderness. He takes them to the mountain. He gives them a law. He makes them his people. And the very first thing they want to do is build a golden calf. Right? They want to be like the nations round about them. Then they're going to reject God as king. Why? Because all the other nations have kings. We should have a king too. Right? And you go through the period of the judges, and one of the scary things about the period of the judges is they begin doing all of the things that the nations around about them have done. You get to that weird story with the Levite and his concubine at the end of the book of Judges. Guess who the people of Israel have become? They have become the 5 cities of the plain. They have become the men of Sodom and Gomorrah and Zeboim and all of those places. That is who they are. Right? Instead of being transformed to become like God, they have become like the world around them. And so here, when you get to the New Testament, the idea is that God is again rescuing a people to be holy to himself out of Egypt, except Egypt now is in Palestine or Levant or whatever you want to call that area over there where Jerusalem is. And then you go over to Revelation, and John in Revelation will actually call the place where Christ is crucified, both Sodom and Gomorrah and Egypt, right? He will call it all of these things. And so the people of God are being called out of the people of God. And that's why you get over and where Paul writes that not all Israel was Israel. And so the law of Moses is meant to bring you to Christ. That's the point. But people want to go back. They want to go back to Egypt. They want to go back to the things that were before. They want to go back to the cucumbers where everything was great and wonderful, where we had food at least. Yeah, we were slaves and everybody was killing us, but hey, it wasn't so bad, right? That's sort of the idea, and that's the image here. You want to go back into slavery when God has set you free. And here the words that you have following this: exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today. How often is that true? Every day. Yeah. Today is today. Tomorrow will be today. The day after that will eventually be today. And it's always today. You never live in tomorrow, and you never live in yesterday. You always live today, which is kind of an interesting picture of eternity. Eternity is always now. That's sort of how you live now, although not. Yes, Bob. Yep. I like your point that this isn't like you wake up one day and on Tuesday you were the most faithful person in the world, and on Wednesday you're like, I don't even know if there's a God. Right? It typically doesn't happen that way. Right? So what I would encourage you to do, if you're here this morning, if you're watching online, wherever you happen to be, if you have questions, ask them. If you have doubts, express them. If you want to know something, make that known. But I promise, if you have a question, nobody is going to yell at you. If you have a doubt about something, nobody is going to think less of you. If you have a question or a doubt or a concern, I guarantee you most people in this room have experienced that same thing at some time. The way to avoid this evil, unbelieving heart is to deal with what you're struggling with, to ask your questions, to get the answers that you need. Yes, Bob. Yes. Yes. It's absolutely a two-way street. It's like a parent with a young child. Right? The kid doesn't tell me if they're sick. Right? They can have 112 fever, they're running around, and they're still trying to play and do all this stuff. It's the parent has to go, wait a minute, you look like you don't feel good. We're going to go lay down, and I'm going to get you an ice pack and maybe an ice bath with 112 fever. And it's my job to notice that there's something off. You know, you're not acting right, you're a little bit more whiny than normal. It's my job to notice that. And we as a family, we should know one another well enough that we kind of notice that too. Hey, something's not right. Their attitude's a little off. They don't look like themselves. They're not, behaving how they're supposed to behave. The person that I know, something's not right. And I would highly encourage you that you don't walk up to that person and go, "You're not acting right." That's not how you start that conversation. But we have to have that conversation. Because if we don't, sometimes people think there's something wrong with them because they have a question or a doubt or a concern. And if we all love one another and if we trust the truth, then there's no fear. Ask any question. If we are seriously and honestly seeking the truth, the God, the creator of the universe, who has revealed these things to us, then we don't have anything to fear. If you want to believe what is true, then you have nothing to fear. There's no question that you should be afraid of. It doesn't mean we know all the answers right off the top of our head, right? But there's no question that should scare us. So don't be afraid to ask. Yes? Yeah. And it certainly seems like the writer or speaker, whatever we're dealing with here, he knows the audience that he's addressing. Because he's going to say later, I expect better things for you. So he knows them. He's not just, he's not giving them platitudes and niceties. He knows that there's an issue. He's dealing with the issue in a straightforward yet loving way. Yes. Yeah, he refers to them as brothers. And so this is an important letter because we see the reality, the possibility of this in the life of a believer or a group of believers. And it is something that we have to watch out for. Because in verse 14, we have come to share in Christ. The same way that they had come to share in the Lord by being baptized into Moses and through that water, receiving manna from heaven. Right? God, they are the Lord's people now. They have a share with God. But we have to hold firm to our original confidence to the end. It's not a one-time thing. You weren't saved one day and now I don't have to do anything about it ever again. I don't have to maintain my relationship. I don't have to maintain my faith. This is something that requires maintenance, just like any human relationship. There was an old guy. He used to be a Texas Ranger. And if you're familiar with the history of the Texas Rangers, that should tell you a little bit about the personality of this guy. He was married to his wife, and one of my friends was teaching a Bible class. And in the Bible class, they were talking about love and how love needs to be expressed. And the guy raised his hand, and he said, "I told my wife I loved her on the day I married her, and if anything changes, I'll let her know." How many of you want that relationship? Not me. I mean, it may be true, he may feel that way, but that's not how human relationships work. I kind of need to be reminded that you like me. It's nice to know. I need to know that you're all in, right? That's how human relationships work. That's how our relationship with God works too. God's all in, right? He is there. He is the one who has redeemed us. He saved us. He is steadfast and sure. And we have to make sure that we stay that way too. Somebody one time said that God is always willing to hold your hand. And so if the two ever part, it isn't God that let go. And that image has stuck with me, holding hands. God doesn't want to let go of your hand, but he's not going to crush your knuckles to keep a grip on you either. And so that's sort of what we're getting here. So if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as in the rebellion. So who was it that heard and rebelled? Now we're getting right to the heart of the questions that we were asking earlier. Was it the Lord's people or the Egyptians? I mean, we could understand, right? If the Egyptians were in the wilderness and they're like, I don't know. This God doesn't seem nice to me. He killed all my cows. But the Israelites? Was it not? And with whom was he provoked? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And who did he swear that they wouldn't enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. And so here is a key thing. The writer in Hebrews, as you'll see with Peter and James and John, they're all talking about the same things that Paul will talk about at great length in the book of Romans, where Paul will argue that you are justified through faith. Here is the argument, right? These people were baptized into Moses, right? They were the ones whom God redeemed with an uplifted arm. They were the ones that God is going to bring to the mountain and give the law. But these people, despite the fact that God is feeding them and caring for them and has saved them, these people were unfaithful. So it doesn't matter that they walked across the Red Sea. It doesn't matter that they were eating the bread that came down out of heaven. Those things that they had done, because they were unfaithful, didn't mean much. You can't look back and say, well, I've crossed the Red Sea, so I'm good. That's not how it worked. The danger for us might be that we would say something, well, when I was however old, I was baptized, I'm good. I'm glad you did that, but that was the very beginning of the journey. You still have a lot of walking left to do until you get to the promised land. And so the warning here is very much like Jim said. These people have come to Jesus. This is their salvation moment, coming to Christ. And now they want to walk back to Egypt. Don't do it. Yep. I don't have well, it is kind of a simple answer, but it's really difficult to do. You have to do what people have always had to do. You have to come back to what God says, and you have to put your faith in that. That's the warning in Deuteronomy 13 when Moses says that dreamers are going to arise among you, and they're going to see dreams and have visions, and they're going to do wonders, and their wonders will come to pass. But then that dreamer is going to say, come, let us go worship other gods, and your job is to listen to what God has said, not to that dreamer. And so there's going to be all these outside influences that are constantly trying to pull people away. One of the dangers that God's people have had throughout history, and you can see this is pretty consistent. People always want to look back to 20 years ago, or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, and say, if we could just go back to 50 years ago. Well, the interesting thing was, if you could do that, if we could get into a time-traveling box, and maybe like in the shape of a British phone booth, and we could go back 50 years to what would that be now? That would only be 1970. Wow. Okay, we'll go with it. So in 1970, you walked out of your time traveling machine and you walked into a church. I guarantee you there would be somebody sitting in those pews saying, if we could just go back to 50 years ago, and then if you went back to 1920, there would be somebody saying, if we could just go back 50 years, and then if you went back, you're going to see how bad I am at math. If we could go back to 1870, and then 1820, and then 1770, I guarantee you there was some Puritan somewhere in New England saying, if we could just go back, because there has been this thought in our brains that backward is better. But the writer in Ecclesiastes says, do not say, weren't the former days better than these, because that isn't from wisdom. The truth is that humanity has always made a mess of everything. There has never been a golden age ever. One of my favorite books that I ever read in the studies that I did in history, it was titled The Good Old Days. They were terrible. And that's what it did. It just went through and it looked at different ages and it talked about how awful people were and the bad things that were happening and the way that we kind of look back on the past with rose-colored glasses. And what we see is that each day presents new and different challenges. Like today, one of the things that we have to worry about that people didn't 100 years ago is all the screens that we have. You know, that's a new challenge. How does that work? The mass propagation of media, how does that work? How do you live faithfully in that? Well, the same way that you lived faithfully when it was messenger pigeons. Right? You come back to what God has said. And that's really the call here in Hebrews. Is what shall we do if we neglect so great a salvation? It's a call back to what God has said, a call back to what God has done. And we as the Lord's people, that has to be our call. That is our trumpet, right? That is our message. That is what we herald. Look at what God has done. Christ has been crucified, buried, and raised from the dead, ascended into the heavens. He's seated at the right hand of majesty on high, and one day he will come back to judge the living and the dead. This is what God has done. It's what God is doing. It's what God will do. And this is always what we come back to, no matter how good or bad things seem. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is doing. Look at what God has been moving you toward. Look at what God has done. Look at what God will do. Don't be moved. That's easy to say. It's hard to do. Because we are pulled from 1,000 different directions. Just like the people who crossed the Red Sea. There were hundreds of gods pulling them in all sorts of different directions. And it was hard for them too. And so I don't have a really good answer other than that. That we have to focus on what God has done, who God is, what God has said, and then we have to encourage each other. Right? That's what it says. You know, exhort one another every day. Being together is important because I need to be encouraged. I need to be reminded. I need to be shown that God is among us, that God is working with us and through us, and that we are being a transformed people, that we are becoming who we ought to be, and that there is a reason to stay faithful. I can't do it by myself. And that's sort of what you see here. It's the curse of wealth. Yeah. Yeah. Moses warns the Israelites. One of the phrases that I like out of the law is the abundance of things. Moses says, because of the abundance of things, you will be faithless to the Lord. And that's sort of I think that's his point. I don't think he's saying that you're going to become rich and that's terrible. You have to stay paupers. I don't think that's his message. I think the message is that you will get to the point where you can buy whatever you want, you have all these things, and you think that you don't need God to provide for you anymore. That's a real danger. And if anybody has ever been exposed to that danger, it is the people who live in the United States today. The most prosperous nation as a whole in the history of humanity. That's dangerous. We think that we are kings and queens and princes and dukes and earls and however those things work, and that we get to order what we want. And if you live in Nashville, since we have Amazon, you can order something and have it delivered to your doorstep in less than 2 hours sometimes. That's pretty close to being a king. And so you have to remember, I'm clay. Beautifully made, right? Wonderfully shapen, yet clay. And God is God. All right, that gets us to chapter 4. We won't have time to cover all of chapter 4 today, but the idea here in chapter 4 is there's this beautiful picture of God's Sabbath, of God's rest. And if you remember back from chapter 3 in Psalm 95, where he says, they are not going to enter my Sabbath. They don't get to be with me. They're not going to enter my rest. This goes all the way back to the creation account. So the promise of entering his rest still stands because it's still today. Let us fear then, in case it seems like you failed to reach it. For the good news came to us just as to them, the news of their deliverance and their salvation. But the message they heard did not benefit them because it wasn't united with faith or by faith with those who listened. So in other words, God came and delivered them. He did these amazing things. He told them that he was their God and they were his people. But despite having done all of those things, walked the riverbed or the seabed over to the new land, they didn't unite their faith with that, and so none of those other things mattered. And so the warning for us is that we who have believed, right, and who are believing, enter that rest. Just as he said, I swore in my wrath, they will not enter my rest. And although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. And so there's this existent rest of God, which is interesting. If you go back to the creation account and you look at the days in the creation account, I think that this is on purpose. Day 1 has an evening and a morning. Day 2, evening, morning. 3, same. 4, same. 5, 6, same. Until you get to day 7. Day 7 never ends in that account. You're never told that the end of the 7th day happens. Now, I mean, sequentially, right? If you have a calendar, in order to get to like the next day, that 7th day has to finish. But in the text itself, there is no end to the 7th day. And when you get here into this, the writer seems to be playing on that. Actually, it was a pretty common thing that Hebrew people did. And so he comes here and he's like, God's rest is ongoing. Although he finished his works from the foundation of the world, there's existent rest. He's spoken somewhere of the 7th day in this way, and God rested on the 7th day from all his works. And again, in this other passage, he said, they will not enter my rest. Therefore, it remains. And so God's rest isn't something that finished. It's something that is ever present. And you can enter into it now, is the picture. It remains for some to enter it. Those who formerly received the good news failed because of disobedience. But he points a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterwards, in the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And this is where we'll stop. We'll pick up in verse 8 next week. There's this choice. God has put his rest before you. He has told you what he has done. He has made the way back to him through Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by him. And you have the choice of whether or not you will enter and remain in that rest. That's up to you. And so I've heard people say, well, there is no Sabbath in the New Testament. There is. It's just not a day of the week. Right? It is this rest that we enter into, this ongoing rest of God. And if you are faithful, you are entering into it. And the call is to remain in it. And this is where the danger that our writer sees here, that these people are going to fall back away and be disobedient. So we'll stop there. Thank you for your comments and for your time.